Today we've got a crazy story of revenge on someone who only got into a relationship just to prevent themselves from being homeless. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, how I dealt mercilessly with a chronic wife beater. Hi guys, my name is Adrian and this is like a revenge story, but judging the kind of work I do, it almost seems like I see many jerks daily that need to be checked. If you haven't figured out by now, I'm a lawyer. Many people say I'm relentless in my pursuit for justice and I've got a strategic mind. It's obvious from my work history too, anyway. Every case I take on is personal, and I don't stop until I've achieved victory for my clients. My reputation precedes me and that's exactly how I like it. My office is on the 15th floor of a sleek, modern building in the heart of downtown. You can picture the office of Harvey Specter from Suits when imagining it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offer a panoramic view of the city skyline. The walls are adorned with framed degrees and accolades, proof of years of hard work and dedication. The air is always filled with a faint hint of coffee, a comforting reminder of the long hours spent here. It was a normal day like this when a long-standing client of mine walked through my door with a case that would test me and bring out the pettiness I thought I'd buried a long time ago. We'll call the client Ken. He was the brother-in-law of a man named Joe. We're calling him Joe for the sake of anonymity, too. A man who had made a habit of abusing his wife and manipulating those around him. Joe was confident. Too confident. He believed his lies and deceit would shield him from any consequences. He'd done it before, using his fists and his lies to secure a favorable settlement with his ex-wife, escaping child support and any real punishment. Joe, from the way Ken described him, was ignorant of the weight of his crimes and thought that he was untouchable. Ken, however, was willing to see him pay for his actions no matter the cost, as it turned out that he was both his brother-in-law and his business partner. As I listened to the details, I knew this would be a battle unlike any I'd faced before. Joe had no idea what was coming. Joe had a long history of abusive behavior. His wife Emily had often shown up at family gatherings with bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves and makeup. Joe's temper was infamous. He would explode over minor inconveniences, smashing furniture and shouting vile threats. One particularly harrowing incident involved Joe locking Emily out of the house on a freezing winter night just to prove a point. He was a master manipulator, convincing neighbors and friends that Emily was clumsy or unstable, ensuring they never questioned his version of events. In business, he was no different. Joe would lie about his finances, deceive partners, and bully employees into silence. His charm, combined with his threats, allowed him to navigate through life without facing the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit began with Mark's claims against Joe for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. As business partners, they had built a successful company together, but Joe's greed had led him to siphon funds, leaving the business and Mark in dire straits. Joe's arrogance was on full display throughout the hearing. It seemed more like he was confident that all the lies and fabricated documents would shield him from any repercussions. He smirked at Mark and me, convinced that his usual tactics of deceit and intimidation would secure his victory. Now fully aware that the lawsuit posed a significant threat to his financial standing, Joe immediately began to hide his assets. He transferred funds to offshore accounts, put properties in the name of friends and family, and even resorted to cash transactions to avoid detection. Joe thought he was being clever, but he underestimated my tenacity and the resources at my disposal. I hired a top-notch investigator who painstakingly tracked every move Joe made. Through forensic accounting and surveillance, we uncovered his hidden accounts and traced his property transfers. Our strategy was relentless. We filed motions to freeze his assets, subpoenaed his associates, and exposed his fraudulent conveyances in court. Each discovery was a blow to Joe's defenses, chipping away at the empire of lies he had constructed. The net was closing in, and Joe was beginning to realize that this time he couldn't slip through the cracks. One particularly notable asset was a lake house registered under his cousin's name. With the evidence we gathered, we proved the transfer was fraudulent, and the court ordered the property seized. Joe also had invested in several luxury vehicles and hidden them in different locations. Through diligent surveillance and legal maneuvers, we located these vehicles and secured court orders to confiscate them. Each asset we uncovered and seized tightened the noose around Joe, stripping away his financial defenses piece by piece. It started to become real to Joe as his desperation grew and frantically tried to protect his remaining assets, resorting to increasingly erratic measures. He sold off valuables at a fraction of their worth, hoping to liquidate quickly before we could act. One memorable instance involved Joe attempting to transfer ownership of his primary residence to a fake entity. We intercepted the transfer just in time, presenting evidence of his fraudulent scheme to the court. The judge ruled in our favor, and the property was seized. I was so bent on making sure he lost everything. I went through Joe's assets like a meat grinder, and after a while, Joe had but one property left, a house, and he clung to that house, for it was rented out and his sole source of income. Joe lived in the unfinished basement, and he survived on what the upstairs tenants paid him. He cashed their rent checks at payday loan places, paying hefty fees, but it was worth it because he knew that I would garnish any bank account that he'd opened. Joe managed to hide his rental place from me for a while because he owned it through a numbered company. But my investigator found him one day and followed him home. Joe self-repped his way through the next stage, which took a couple of years while I punctured his corporate veils and his sad efforts at a fraudulent conveyance. But in the end, I had his last house, the house where he lived in the unfinished basement. Joe stepped out one day to get a pack of cigarettes, and when he came back, the sheriff had changed the locks. "Can my client at least live in the basement?" Joe's lawyer said to me, pro bono, because by this point Joe had nothing to pay lawyers. I knew the pro bono guy. He practiced law nearby. As I was talking to him, I could see pro bono guy's office window across the parking lot from my office tower window. Joe had managed to hold onto his old truck, a symbol of his last shred of independence. He parked it near his former rental property, now owned by one of Mark's employees. In a fit of rage, Joe blocked the driveway with his truck, thinking he could still control something in his life. I saw an opportunity to make a point. I called the tow truck operator I knew from my criminal defense days and had Joe's truck towed. But instead of impounding it, I instructed the operator to fill the tank and give it an oil change before parking it directly outside Joe's lawyer's office. The next day, Joe's pro bono lawyer called me, fuming. "Why didn't you tell me Joe's truck was outside my office?" he demanded. "Is that so?" I replied coolly. "How careless of my bailiff. Your client can take his truck, but let him know if I see it again. I'll seize it to satisfy the judgment." Watching from my office window, I saw Joe's shoulders slump as he walked to his truck. He had lost everything: his home, his assets, his dignity. The truck, now filled with gas and running smoothly, was a bitter reminder that he was allowed to keep only what I permitted. As Joe drove away, defeated and broken, I savored the moment. Justice had been served, not just through the courts, but through a carefully executed plan that left Joe with nothing but the bitter taste of his own downfall. As Joe climbed into his truck, his face was a mask of despair. The swagger and confidence that once defined him were gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Each turn of the key, each sputter of the old engine was a reminder of his downfall. He had lost everything: his properties, his wealth, his dignity. The realization hit him hard as he stared out at the windshield, contemplating his ruined life. His attempts to lie, cheat, and intimidate had failed him. He was left with nothing but the bitter fruits of his own actions. The truck, once a symbol of his independence, now felt like a prison on wheels. Joe's emotional and psychological state was shattered, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. He drove away slowly, the weight of his complete ruin pressing down on him with every smile. From my office window, I watched Joe's truck disappear into the distance. A sense of profound satisfaction washed over me. This wasn't just another legal victory, it was a meticulously crafted act of justice. Every step, every move had been planned with precision to ensure Joe faced the full consequences of his actions. Seeing his final defeat, knowing that he was left with nothing but the mercy I had shown by allowing him to keep his truck, was a powerful moment. I reflected on the journey that had brought us here, the relentless pursuit of justice, the strategic maneuvers, and the unwavering commitment to righting the wrongs Joe had inflicted. My thoughts drifted to Mark and Emily, knowing that their suffering had been avenged. In this line of work, victories come in many forms, but this one, watching a man brought low by his own misdeeds, was particularly sweet. Justice had been served, and I delivered it with unwavering resolve. That wasn't the end though. The divorce proceedings were the next. I wasn't a qualified divorce lawyer, but I was so bent on seeing him pay through his nose that I referred my client's sister to one of the best divorce attorneys I knew, and since she was from me, the divorce attorney fee was reduced by half. Mary had a solid case against him, and he'd already been pretty much. There was nowhere to run to. She provided evidence of the abuse, including police reports and photos of her injuries. The court sympathized with Mary and granted her full custody of the children. Joe was ordered to pay alimony and child support, which was a significant financial blow to him. The legal fees from the divorce added to Joe's mounting debts. He tried to cut corners by representing himself in court, but his lack of legal knowledge only made things worse. He made numerous errors, which the judge did not overlook. Joe's debts began to spiral out of control. As the divorce case dragged on, Joe's financial situation worsened. He had taken out several payday loans to cover his expenses, each with exorbitant interest rates. The loans quickly snowballed and Joe found himself trapped in a cycle of debt. His truck, the last asset he had, was barely keeping him afloat. Mary, on the other hand, was thriving. With Joe out of her life, she found a steady job and moved into a small but cozy apartment with the kids. She managed to save some money and eventually bought a used car. Mary was determined to provide a stable environment for her children, far away from Joe's toxic influence. It was good enough that she won the case. His added suffering was a plus. Perhaps next time he'd think before acting like he was untouchable. So I certainly imagine in that line of work, there might be a number of stories that come along that pull at your heartstrings and you go, you know what, I really just want to do some pro bono work here. I just want to get my Kim Wexler on. But obviously, like doing any job for free, it's probably not a sustainable thing and you don't do it all too often. But a story like that, I feel like a story like that makes it pretty easy to go pro bono. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is Nothing Like Getting Petty Revenge on My Partner, Marty. The idea of not being able to properly and fully express yourself has always been one of the things that's held me back for as long as I can remember. My parents were also a critical part of this too, as they were the ones I feared the most when I was still realizing who I really was. But thankfully, we were able to clear the air on things as regards to that, and this was all thanks to my now partner and husband, Marty. I, male 36, and my partner and husband Marty, male 34, had been together for the longest time, and the idea of being with anyone else besides was never even on the verge of crossing my mind. And the reason for this was due to the fact that we both truly loved one another. However, there truly are some things that would eventually become tiring in the relationship, and this might definitely occur much later on down the line when both parties have gone way past their honeymoon phase. Our story began some 18 years back, when I was still in my second year in high school. I think I was around the age of 18 at the time, and this, if my memory serves me right, was the exact moment where I was already beginning to have doubts about my sexuality, as I could feel it deep down that I was not even in the slightest least attracted to the opposite genders. And this was evident when the day for lovers was upon us and I was wholly uninterested in any of their activities. It just seemed like I was outright bitter to the entire notion of Valentine's Day. But then again, no one really got to know what the real reason behind my supposed terrible mood was. Everyone except Marty. He was my senior back in high school, just above me in grades by just a single year. I don't know the particular reason, but then I realized that he truly was interested in me at the time, and it was exactly how I thought he was interested in me, that is, in a romantic way. And this was something that I was initially uncomfortable with, reason being that I still wasn't sure of where I stood relative to my sexuality. But then again, after having more than one conversation and interaction with Marty, both within the school premises and outside the school premises, I was able to truly realize who I was deep down, and I finally accepted that part of myself. And just as you would expect, Marty was the very first and only person I'd ever been in a relationship with, as he was the one that truly made me come to terms with my sexuality and all. As at this time, things were supposedly meant to be fine between us out in the open, but then there was still one thing holding me back greatly, so much so that it was almost causing quite some trouble between Marty and myself, and this was the idea of getting accepted or rejected by my parents. It was something I struggled with for the longest time, and this was due to the fact that both my parents were no-nonsense parents. What this means is that they were the kinds of parents a child would grow up with that tolerates little to no mishaps. They were the definition of true perfectionists. They wanted everything to be perfect, nothing more, nothing less. Most especially my father, who was one of the most disciplined persons I knew. I guess you can understand why this would pose a serious problem for me at the time. In fact, the issue wasn't even in telling my parents, or rather coming out to them. No, that would have seemed meager compared to the problem I had. The issue, rather, was what was going to happen right after I had done so. And I was so scared of the countless possibilities and the one I was almost certain would occur. And that was what frightened me the most. Marty had come to me countless times to just trust that my parents would understand, but it was easier said than done. But eventually, I had resolved myself to tell my parents the truth about myself and my sexuality and hope for the best. But this resolution was only strengthened by the fact that I was finally going to be done with high school, and if at all the results of my telling my parents was going to be negative, I wanted it to be that I would have the freedom to live by myself without the support of my parents. Also, I had Marty to support me, so it truly made the world of difference. Thankfully, everything went in the opposite direction of what I was expecting, and my supposed strict parents were even all the more ecstatic. It was nice, don't get me wrong, but then it felt unreal. Anyways, that's about how I came out and how Marty was there to support me through it all when I was coming out to my parents. Now, a few years later, after quite a lot of events had transpired in both mine and Marty's lives, we were already celebrating our 8-year anniversary when bad luck struck Marty's family. Now, for context, this anniversary was our wedding anniversary, as we'd already gotten married to each other when we both were done with college some 8 years back. So this part of my story is following the events of my coming out to my parents, which occurred some 10 years back. Now, the terrible incident that happened was when Marty and I got the news that his parents had passed away in an accident when they were traveling by road, and that there was not even the slightest chance of their survival. This was a really dark time for the both of us and members of his family, as they were relatively young for parents of their age, and they were one of the nicest people I'd ever come to know. However, no matter how bad I felt, nothing could really compare to how Marty must have felt, because I could tell that he totally changed after the incident with his parents. Firstly, his mother was the one person in the whole world that he truly loved and respected with all of his heart. She was the only person that truly supported him when he came out to them, and even after everyone wasn't on his side, his mother was the only one that stood by him, and in her absence, he felt like he truly had no direction in his life. I tried my possible best to be there for him and make sure that he never felt alone. I knew that I wouldn't be able to remotely fill in the void left by his mother, but then again, it was something that I'd resolved myself to doing for him simply because I loved and cared for him, and adding him at his lowest point in his life was something that really affected me a lot. The only problem with what I'd planned was the fact that he wasn't even in the slightest willing to listen to anything I had to say. It seemed like he was hell-bent on seclusion, and this was something I would not allow. Not while I was still alive anyways. A few weeks after his parents passed, his attitude had changed, and not for the better. He had now picked up a terrible habit of using and abusing drugs and some certain substances, of which were already having adverse effects on him. I know Marty, and I know when he wasn't okay. And I could tell from the way he was looking, acting, and behaving only after a month of the substance usage that he was far from okay. The more I tried to work to get him to change, the more he pushed me away, and the fact that he was the only person I loved and cherished that much made his actions hurt the more. I was devastated. The feeling of helplessness was really starting to get to me until I went to my parents for advice because I was already feeling like a stranger in our relationship, and I sought professional help as my parents were the ones with the most experience on their hands. They intervened and registered Marty for a rehabilitation program, as this was the first step in getting him back. The program was meant to last for a whole year, and I was only permitted to visit him after he'd spent 3 months being clean. Those first 3 months being away from him was hard, but then it was definitely worth it, as right after, I got to see the man I was married to, standing right before my eyes, finally looking like he had a spark in his eyes, unlike the dead and cold face he had on since the passing of his parents. Things were starting to look good, and I was so happy with the progress he was making. Soon, the entire year was over, and he was cleared and ready to come home. Our lives soon returned to normal, and the new normal was Marty always apologizing and feeling bad, as he felt guilty for the way he acted during that time, and begged for forgiveness in the process. I was willing to listen to him, but then I couldn't let go of how I was feeling back then, and how his actions and behavior made me feel, and I thought of a simple way to get simple payback, just to make myself feel good. So I know for a fact that he doesn't like hearing anything about what happened within that period, as to him, this was a really dark time and all, but then I really thought that this would be helpful for him and also annoying, and either way, I would get the joy and revenge I wanted. So I searched online and found some ads that were looking for previous drug addicts for a campaign program a certain organization was running, and I immediately signed him up with a lifetime subscription to the platform. I then made it so that he was never going to know who signed him up, as I informed the organizers that I'm his partner and that it was something I wanted to do for him anonymously. At first, the frequent and incessant calls during random hours of the day was quite disturbing, but then again, when I saw how annoyed he usually gets whenever a call comes in, it definitely felt worth the non-existent effort I put in. It always makes me feel good about myself and my actions. I don't regret anything I've ever done, one single bit. I mean, hearing this story, really the only thing that sticks in my mind is being glad that for OP and their partner's sake, things turned around and worked out so well in the end, considering all the difficulties they went through up to that point. That said, our next story is, I got my hobosexual ex kicked out of his girlfriend's house. I almost got in trouble for vandalizing my ex-boyfriend's and his new girlfriend's house. Thankfully, I was able to very narrowly escape the police coming after me. While it was a very scary period for me and I lived in fear of getting disbarred and going to jail, looking back now, I feel awesome for doing that to him, even though I wouldn't do it again, but only because it would be stupid to put my career and freedom at risk just to get back at a boy for rejecting me. My ex was 32 when we first met, and I was 28. We met at a homeless shelter where I volunteered. Apart from being a great lawyer, I'm a great cook, so I volunteered in the shelter's kitchen and cooked them dinner every evening. I only volunteered there because my friend and colleague at work made me. We had an argument and she said I was out of touch with reality and needed to go out and know what it was like for people who weren't as privileged. Basically, she told me to go out and touch grass. My ex was also volunteering at the shelter and working in the kitchen too. His reason for volunteering was because he used to be homeless. He told me about how he didn't have any money and he had no place to live, so he moved into a homeless shelter in another state. What he didn't disclose to me, though, was that he was coming to the homeless shelter to eat. He didn't just used to be broke, he was still broke. He said he decided that living on the streets wasn't worth it, so he went home to his mother and she took a tiny amount for rent. That wasn't true, though. His mother wasn't taking any money from him for rent, but she wasn't letting him eat her food, so he was living with his mother but eating at the shelter. I didn't get to know all this until after I'd fallen in love with him. I didn't see him as the broke, lazy bum he was at the time. I just thought he was someone with a lot of potential who just got confused at some point. He wasn't the perfect picture of a bum anyway. He had a degree, but he didn't study a course that he liked, so he did poorly in school and didn't graduate with an impressive grade. He was also smart and talked a lot. He had a lot to say. Too many big plans that I look back now and can't believe I didn't notice how unrealistic and plain stupid many of those plans were. I was just a stupid girl in love looking to build up her man. We started dating and I found out after a short while that he was eating at the shelter. He was embarrassed at first, but I told him there was nothing to be ashamed about. At least he wasn't hurting anyone or doing something illegal to make money. I even thought it was nice that he volunteered at a homeless shelter to feed, but I didn't like that he lied to me, so I made him confess his lies to me. It was then that I found out that his mother didn't want him around. He said she was already frustrated about him not getting anywhere close to success. He said he didn't blame her because he'd failed too many times. I was going to ask if he wanted to move into my home, but I decided against it since we hadn't known each other for long at the time, and our relationship was barely 4 months old. That man's love-bombed me. He presented himself as the perfect man for me and made me believe that all he needed to do was start making some money, and he'd be my dream man. I asked him to move in with me when one day, I didn't hear from him. That was unusual because we spoke twice every day, so I called him to find out if he was alright, but he wasn't responding. I had to drive over to his mom's home. He came out to see me and looked really upset. He said his mom came to him very early that morning and called him a failure. She said so many mean things to him that broke his spirit. He began to feel like a failure and decided that he wanted to stay out of my life. I'm going to be honest, when he said that to me, I panicked. I was already crazy in love with him. I had started to imagine what our life would look like together and all that. I didn't want to think of him thinking of leaving me. I immediately asked him to move in with me. He asked if I would be comfortable with him in my house, seeing as he doesn't have any money and won't be able to contribute financially. I told him it was okay, and we kissed. I honestly thought he would maybe move in the next week or perhaps the next day at the very least, but he went into the house, picked up his bag, and dumped it in the truck. It was as though he'd already planned the whole thing because it didn't seem like he even had to pack his stuff in the bag. He had quite obviously already packed his bag, but I didn't care. He moved in, and that was how I started my journey as his maid, teacher, and sponsor. I did all the chores in the house because I worried that asking him to do them would make him feel emasculated. I picked up after him and did most of the cooking. On the days I couldn't cook, I would pay for us to eat out or have pizza delivered to the house. He did nothing at all. Some days he went out job hunting, and some other days he would stay back in the house and played video games all day. On some days, he would tell me that he wanted to take a break and spend his time doing some thinking. I always thought it was strange that someone who did nothing wanted to rest from, well, doing nothing. I was starting to become very concerned about his joblessness. I just didn't see how he could be comfortable doing nothing and making no money. I told him to be more serious about seeking a job, and he got mad. He accused me of trying to make him do something he didn't want to do, even though I didn't even specifically tell him the kind of job he needed to get. I just suggested that he got a job. He said he wanted to be an actor. I paid for an acting class. I paid for an accent class, a dancing class, and even paid for improv classes. I managed to convince an old friend to find him an agent. He tried very hard and eventually found an agent that was willing to take my ex-boyfriend in. 3 months into their relationship, my ex bailed and accused his agent of trying to sabotage him by only recommending minor roles for him. The annoying thing was he never accepted a role. He just expected the main character roles to fall in his lap. He tried his hands on being a cook, but that failed too. He'd also tried starting a band, joining a band, and starting a food truck business. He tried so many things, and I funded all these with my money. After nearly 2 years of carrying this adult human on my back, he started sleeping with my neighbor. This neighbor was 5 years younger than me, a young woman with a little trust fund set aside. Her older sister was married to a famous basketball player too. I guess my ex, being the user that he was, thought he could get something off of being with her. I caught him sneaking out of her house once, and I confronted her. I didn't expect that she would do that kind of thing to me. When I confronted her, she went off on me. Accused me of treating my boyfriend like crap, even though he paid for me to take the bar exams. I was shocked. I had already figured at the time that my man was a liar, but I didn't think that he would tell that kind of sick, twisted lie against me. I tried to explain to her that he was lying, but she refused to listen. Before I could move another muscle, my ex had moved in with her. You know what pissed me off the most? A month before I found out that he was cheating, I think they both wanted me to find out, he asked me for a loan. He made something up about starting a business with one of his friends. He promised that it was just a loan and that he would pay it back. He never did. I figured later that he needed the money to impress his new girlfriend. Seeing my ex with my neighbor really hurt me, but I was more furious than hurt. I was ready to deal with them in whatever way I could. Legally or illegally, I planned to break into their house and vandalize their stuff. The night before the night, my friend and I had a movie night in her house. She made popcorn and we ate. I made sure we were together the whole time, so our stories would be the same when the cops inevitably asked about where I was. So when they asked, we told them that we were together doing the things that we did on the day before. I also made sure that even though she washed the utensils used, she left some marks on it so it was obvious that we did make popcorn and spent the night watching a movie together. I broke into their house from the back door the night after I had movie night with my friend and destroyed everything I could destroy without making a noise and attracting the attention of others in our neighborhood. The girl had a large, beautiful kitchen because she was a blogger and used to blog about food, recipes, and all that. When I was done destroying my ex's stuff and breaking stuff in the house, like mirrors and my ex's PlayStation, I started a little fire in her kitchen. I was shaking while doing all of this because the repercussions would have been disastrous if I'd gotten caught, but I didn't care. Hell hath no fury as a woman scorned. My ex had hurt me badly and I was certain that doing that to them would ruin their relationship. When I was done, I sneaked out of the house. An old lady noticed the fire and immediately called for help. Naturally, the two fools named me as the primary suspect, and I was invited by the police for an interview. I lied that I was with my friend the whole evening and that we watched a movie together and all that. They checked with my friend and went along with it. I don't think they completely believed me, but where was the proof that I started the fire and vandalized their stuff? My little neighbor was devastated and sent my ex out of the house. The old lady who had noticed the fire told me that she'd told him that she needed space to handle what had happened to their house. My ex, who is a completely shameless man, tried to get back together with me. He even started talking about how I'm growing older and he didn't want me to stay single for the rest of my life. I cussed him out and told him to go back to his mother's home. So, can I just say what OP did? Little extreme. Honestly, if I were OP and my eyes were open to the hobosexual ex, a term which, by the way, I only learned after reading this title, but basically, if I'd learned his true nature, I would be like, they deserve each other. Good luck to her. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.